Madeleine Morris reporting, and I'm joined now by the Immigration Minister Scott Morrison. You've said variously this week that these people are economic migrants. How did you determine that?
People who are Tamils in India are not subject to persecution as a result of their Tamil ethnicity. And now that is, I think, widely understood. It's certainly my understanding of it, and it's certainly the assurances that have been provided by the Indian government. I mean, the UNHCR themselves have recognised that India has provided a safe haven for Tamils
just a
for
moment.
decades.
I mean, there are plenty of people we accept as refugees who come through transit countries. You have called these people economic migrants.
I think they are, Sarah.
Have you heard their cases for asylum? You're aware that they've all
Sarah,
made
I think
cases.
The suggestion that Tamils fleeing India, allegedly, because they're being persecuted in India because they're Tamils, just, I think, doesn't bear up to the international experience and the recognition of the Indian government's provision of safe haven to Tamils in India for a very, very long time. Frankly, I think it's quite offensive to India, Sarah.
Well, I think actually I'm a little confused, and I suspect therefore the audience is confused. Why are their claims for persecution necessarily about their time in India? Those claims may just as well apply, or far more likely, in fact, apply to their lives in Sri Lanka. Now, what do you know about them that enables you to assert so clearly that they have no claim for persecution from their time in Sri Lanka?
Sarah, I've made no comment in relation to Sri Lanka. I've made a comment in relation to them leaving India, and my comments in relation to them leaving India. And that's why I've been working with the Indian government to come to an arrangement where many of them who have been resident in India for a very long time could be considered for return. Now, they may well have wished to return to India rather than the other options that are on the table here, which is obviously offshore processing.
Now, do you think that anybody listening to you during this week would have heard anything other than the Immigration Minister asserting that these people are economic migrants?
Well, I can't speak for what people hear and think, and based on the reporting this week, Sarah, I couldn't possibly do that. My position, I think, has been crystal clear. People have left India, and the suggestion was that people were being persecuted in India. And my simple statement was that's obviously a nonsense.
But you'd be well aware now from the evidence in your own case in the High Court that they're making asylum claims, and that some of those claims refer to, as I understand it, their lives in Sri Lanka, not in India. So would you like to take the opportunity to amend that statement?
No, there's no need to amend my statement. I'm simply saying that people saying they're being fleeing persecution in India, remember, and those comments have been made by their own lawyers this week, asserting that it's possible that this could be the case. Well, I just don't think that bears out with the international experience, and it certainly doesn't bear out with India's track record of how they've treated Tamils in India. That's why we've been working to provide the opportunity for people to go back to India. Now, there's an opportunity to do this under the arrangement we've come to with the Indian government.
Just while we're on that Indian government, just briefly, will the Indians accept forcible returns?
Well, the first step is, will they agree to meet with consular officials? Now, the normal process is that no consular official can be forced on an individual, and if they're receiving advice, whether it's from lawyers or advocates or others, to refuse that, then they will be passing up the opportunity to potentially return to India where they were safe. Now, if they choose not to do that, then that's a matter for them. And it could be possible that all of them may choose not to speak to Indian consular officials, and in so doing, they will pass up an opportunity to potentially to be reunited with their families in India.
I think people would be very confused about Sri Lankans being sent to see, or having Indian officials sent to see Sri Lankans. But let's move on, because there are some other topics to cover here.
You've raised that point, so let me address it. They've been living in India, the vast majority of people on this vessel, for a very long time, and they have family in India. And so what I have done...
So you know that the majority of people on this boat, you are asserting that they have lived in India for a very long time, the majority.
That is our understanding of who's on this vessel. Now, we are providing an opportunity for them to go back to India, and they could make that request to Indian consular officials over the course of the next week. Now, if advocates are telling them they shouldn't talk to consular officials, then I question whether they're acting in their best interest.
All right, let's
because
move on.
They will pass up that opportunity. It is rare for India to concede and bringing back someone who was not a citizen. Now, they're prepared to do that, they told me, for humanitarian reasons. And if advocates are going to deny them that opportunity, then where they end up will be very much a consequence of that decision.
They were at sea for a very long time. Why didn't you just take them straight to India?
Well, we were working towards that objective.
And did India say no?
We discussed 3 options with India.
No, did India say no?
Well, let me tell you what we discussed with India. We discussed 3 options. One was that they could be taken to India where that process, which I've talked about, their identity and so on, could be assessed. That was not accepted by India. It could also be done on the ship, and that was logistically difficult to get Australian, Indian consular officials to that ship. And so in those circumstances, we chose to do it this way. Now, we'll see how it goes. But if the outcome of this is that no one chooses to talk to Indian consular officials, then the government's policy is very clear. And they will go to offshore processing, and that's where their claims will be assessed. They will never, ever be resettled in Australia, and that will be the outcome, and nor will they ever be able to probably ever go back to India again.
Was there any attempt to take them to India on orange lifeboats?
Well, I don't discuss those sorts of operational matters, Sarah.
Well, in this case, it's not like a normal on-water matter. We're talking about potentially a much longer journey. Were the orange lifeboats a consideration in this case?
The government always considers all of our operational options that are available to us. We work through a methodical process.
Orange lifeboats?
Well, I always reserve those options to us, as does Lieutenant General Campbell. But when and where and how we do those things, they're operational matters.
So how far were you prepared to send people on those orange lifeboats? This is a very different scenario.
Well, Sarah, you're now getting into operational details, which you know is not the government's policy to discuss, based on the advice I have from Lieutenant General Campbell.
Just to go back to the principles at work here, the bottom line is that you made a decision, I think, on the 1st of July that you were going to send these people back without finding out whether they had an asylum claim. That breaches the basic principle of international law. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, Sarah, I reject the assertion you've just made. You've just asserted that I was seeking to take them back to Sri Lanka, based on your own argument before that they were fleeing Sri Lanka from persecution.
I beg your pardon. I'm actually going on what the Prime Minister told. Well, let me just tell you. You said on my own assertion it's actually not. I'm quoting Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, who said I would expect most of the people on that boat to go back to their countries of origin, plural. So presumably that included Sri Lanka. Did it?
Well, what he was referring to was the place from where they've come from, and the origin of that voyage was India.
Countries. He said countries of origin. Let me just make the question very clear, Mr Morrison. Did you consider sending them back to Sri Lanka?
There was no attempt during the course of that past month. There was no discussion with the government of Sri Lanka about people on that voyage going back to Sri Lanka, and I'll tell you why. That voyage did not come from Sri Lanka. It came from India. People were living in India or had transited through India. And there is an opportunity for them to return to India if they choose to speak to Indian consular officials, and if they choose not to do that, I assume on the advice of lawyers and advocates and others, and why they would do that against what is possibly in their best interests, others would have to explain.
Let me just move on. The Human Rights Commissioner, Gillian Triggs, says that virtually all of the 174 children on Christmas Island are sick. Children are self-harming, biting themselves, banging into furniture, swallowing poisons. How can this possibly be justified?
Well, I don't believe that's true. For a start, under this government, we've reduced the number of children in detention by almost 35%. The number of children on Christmas Island has dramatically reduced by over 60%. Under this government, we've funded children going to school in detention. On Nauru, we've funded the establishment of facilities including schools.
As you're aware, that wasn't my question. You're saying that Gillian Triggs is making up that evidence about the sickness of children?
I don't think there is evidence of the claim that the High Commission, the Human Rights Commissioner has made in the way that she has made it. These are difficult environments, and appropriate care is provided by our people. I think they're quite sensational claims that have been made. She herself is not a doctor, and we have medical people who are there who provide that care on a daily basis.
All right, just very briefly, because we need to clear this up before we go, so there's no confusion over the orange boats. You did consider the use of the orange boats to return those asylum seekers
I'm not going to
India.
let you put words in my mouth. What I'm saying is the government reserves its right to exercise any and every option that we choose is in the Australian national interest. And that is always my position. I haven't commented specifically on the matter you've referred to because that's not my practice to do that.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.